About 15 years ago, in late September, my friend Josh and I decided we wanted to go camping. We lived in California, so the weather was pretty good year-round. Josh and I were always getting into trouble for doing stupid things we had no right to be doing, such as putting Mentos and Coke bottles behind grocery stores, skipping school to hang out by the river, going to the park late at night and yelling like coyotes. You know, stupid teenager things. We were both 17 at the time, and only Josh had his license. Both of our parents were pretty protective, so there was no way they were going to let us go camping just by ourselves. So we both lied to our parents and said we were going to stay the night at each other's houses. Josh picked me up from my house around 3 p.m., and we stopped at the grocery store to get a bunch of junk food for camping. After that, we waited for his dad to leave for work so we could sneak into his parents' garage and get the camping supplies. By the time we were done with all of this, we had gotten on the road about 4:30 p.m. The campsite was a fair distance away, but luckily Josh had a tendency to speed, so we managed to get to the campgrounds around 6 p.m. When we arrived, we noticed that the entrance parking lot was pretty empty. In the vast space, there was just another car, as well as the park ranger's truck. We headed to the front booth and asked the woman who was attending it which campsites were available. She let us know that out of about 60 sites, only one was taken, and it was at the far end of the park. Josh and I knew we were going to probably be loud and make a bunch of noise, so we decided to take the campsite on the opposite end. The way that this campground was set up was that you had to park your car at the entrance of the state park and then haul your camping gear to your campsite. We didn't bring a wagon, so we had to make a couple of trips to bring the tent, sleeping bags, cooler, and groceries. To save time on the last trip to the car, I told Josh to start setting up the tent and that I would go back to the car to bring the last 2 bags of groceries. It was quite a distance away, about 10 minutes to get to the car and back. I was starting to think that picking a camping spot at the far end of the park was a dumb idea. The sun had already started to set when I was walking back. I kept hearing pine cones and small twigs fall from the trees, as well as the sounds of squirrels and chipmunks running through the bushes. It's funny that even in a state park, you feel as if at any moment you could be ambushed by a bear or a mountain lion. At least, that is what I thought. I was pretty much on edge the whole way back to camp because of how dim the tall pine trees made the forest path. When I arrived, Josh was about halfway done setting up the tent. He mentioned that I should probably start on the fire, otherwise we were going to have a rough time looking around camp. By the time the tent was fully set up and I had got the fire started, the sun had completely gone down, and now only our little campfire was lighting our surroundings. "Dude, I told you we were going to need flashlights," I said to Josh.
"Well, I thought we were going to be able to bring our car to the campsite, so I didn't think it was going to take us until night to set up. My bad,"
he said. We had enough firewood to last us the whole night with no problem, but we wanted to be very cautious with the amount of firewood that we used so it would last the whole night. Because of this, we decided we should probably eat dinner early so we wouldn't be hungry late into the night. I threw a couple of logs on the fire and broke out a package of hot dogs and buns from the cooler. "How many do you want?" I said to Josh.
"Could you cook me 3? I'm going to go to the restroom, but I'll be right back,"
he said. "Yeah, sure, no problem. Do you want me to leave you out the mustard or ketchup?"
"Just mustard is fine."
Josh turned his flash on his phone and then started to walk toward the restrooms, which were located in the center of the park. As I put the hot dogs on the skewers, I watched Josh and his phone light fade off into the dark forest, along with the sounds of his footsteps. And then that feeling, that same uneasy feeling that I had earlier, started to creep back up into my head. I got up and propped the skewers on the picnic table and threw a couple of large dry logs on the fire so I would have some extra light in the area. The fire now crackled bright and healthy. I could see in all directions very clearly, and I started to feel a little safer and at ease. I continued to cook the hot dogs and prepared my food to eat. I went to open YouTube on my phone so I could have some music or some video playing, but up here in the mountains, there was no signal at all, so instead, I just ate along to the sound of the fire. After some time, I began to notice that Josh had been gone for quite a while now. It didn't worry me too much. I thought that he might have been going number 2, but his food was beginning to get cold. I was about to get ready to turn my phone flash on and start walking toward the restrooms to see what was taking him so long. Just then, he came walking back into camp from the silhouette of the forest. "You scared the crap out of me," I said. "I didn't hear you or see your phone flashlight at all. Your hot dogs are on the picnic table, but they're probably cold and need to be heated up." He looked at the plate of hot dogs, and then at me, and then at the plate of hot dogs again, and sat down at the other end of the table, away from his food. "Are you okay? Did you have hemorrhoids or something?" I joked. He didn't say anything. He just looked into the fire. "Okay, weirdo. Well, I'm going to use the restroom, but I'll be back in a bit."
"Sleep,"
he said. "What? It's only like 9:30.
"Sleep."
He said again, this time more forcefully. "Dude, shut up and eat your hot dogs. Stop being weird." He stood up from the bench and walked inside of the tent. I heard some rustling, and then it stopped abruptly. Assuming he was trying to play some kind of weird act or joke, I turned the flash on my phone and started walking toward the restrooms. It was very hard to see any path or trail, just a faint yellow light in the distance from the street light in the parking lot entrance. I felt I was about halfway there when I tripped over a log and dropped my phone. "Fuck," I said under my breath. I started to feel around the ground, blindly searching for my phone. My hands were scraping all of the dried pine needles and dirt in an outwards fanning motion, until finally my hand met something warm. I thought it was a skunk or a possum, so I flinched back and stood still, trying to force my eyes to adjust to what was around me. I could faintly see a small white light on the ground to my left. It was coming from my phone, being camera side down in a bed of pine needles. I picked it up and looked around where I had fallen. What I thought was a small woodland creature was actually the arm of my friend Josh. Attached to it was his lifeless body on the ground, his empty, lifeless eyes staring back at me. His stomach and his intestines had been completely eviscerated from his body, along with the rest of his organs. I could see his spine and his ribs, nothing else. I instantly thought he had been attacked by a mountain lion, but even then, who the hell, or what the hell, was in the tent back at the campsite? My head started to spin. It suddenly felt like I had electricity running down my neck. I felt nauseous and sick, like I was going to throw up and faint at the same time. There was such a loud ringing in my ears, but I was still able to hear a voice in my head saying, "Run! Get out of there! Run! Move! Come on, run! Get out of there! Move!" Over and over again. It seemed like I would never become unfrozen. Thankfully, my body automatically did a 180, and I started running toward the entrance of the parking lot. Josh's car keys bounced erratically in my pants pocket. I had a death grip on my phone. I was running so fast through the forest that all I could hear was the screaming of the wind in my ears, along with the voice inside my head saying, "Run! Get out of there! Run! Move! Come on, run! Get out of there! Move!" I kept hearing it over and over in my head, knowing that if I stopped, I could end up like Josh. I felt every creature in the forest watching me, like the earth beneath me was trying to swallow me whole. Every tree was trying to block me. The forest had now turned into my enemy. For a moment I thought I was going to lose my mind, until at last I had reached the edge of the parking lot. I ran down the gravel road and all the way up to Josh's car. I got in lightning fast, locked the door, quickly started the car, and floored it. As I was nearing the exit, I noticed the park ranger's truck was gone and that the lady who had been attending the entrance booth had left for the night. I turned onto the main road and tried calling 911 from my phone, but there was absolutely no signal. I drove about 25 minutes to get to the nearest gas station and parked my deceased friend's car right up to the entrance. Once I ran inside, I told the cashier I needed to use their landline phone to call the cops. When the police had got there, I gave them my story. They thought I was just some dumb kid who was acting out. They gave me a breathalyzer test, which I passed. It was concerning to them that I was driving Josh's car this far away from home without Josh in it, and they saw that I had a state park pass on the dashboard. Because of this, they did send a couple of cars up to the park to look for Josh. When they got to the park, they looked around for a body, or signs of a struggle, or someone in the tent. There was nothing. They questioned the other campers that had been on the other side of the park, whether they had heard anything that night, whether they heard fighting or gunshots, and they said no. They soon had bloodhounds search the area, and no one and no animal could find a trace of Josh. He was just gone. My childhood friend of 10 years was taken by something that night, and I will never know what the hell it was. To this day, whenever I am driving on the road and I pass by a dense collection of trees, that feeling of being watched comes back to me. But it is not bears or mountain lions that I fear anymore. I've been a truck driver for a few months. I've seen some weird things. When I first took this job to be an over-the-road trucker, I thought it would be really exciting. I thought I'd get to travel the country and see the sights and come home with stories to tell my friends and family. I was right. This job is exciting, but I soon found that I'm better off not sharing these stories with anyone close to me. Not because I don't trust them, but because I'm worried they wouldn't believe me. Let me back up. My name is Brittany. I'm 22 years old, and I've been driving with a rather large company that I won't name for obvious reasons for a few months now. Ever since my training ended, I got my own truck to start solo. I've seen some pretty weird shit. When you're driving the loneliest road in America, yes, that's its real name, in the middle of nowhere, Nevada, things can start to get to you. I suppose it was only a matter of time before I saw something out in the desert at nearly midnight. I still had another hour to the nearest truck stop, and blasting the freezing cold air against my face was all I could do to keep myself from dozing off at the wheel. Irresponsible, I know, but until you work this job you don't understand how much lax comes with it. I was driving this highway in the desert in the pitch blackness of a cold summer night when suddenly something runs out in the road in front of me. Before I can even react, it's gone across the other side into the bushes. I barely got a good look at it, but I could have sworn it looked like a large, white dog, faster than any dog I've ever seen. I try to just ignore it and keep driving. I see animals crossing the road at night all the time. It didn't seem like anything to get worked up about. Not even a minute later, I feel my truck lurch to the left and into the other lane. I quickly try to swerve and correct it and easily step on the brake so I don't wreck. It can be real easy to jackknife an 80,000-pound metal death machine. I slow it down and regain control. I look for the nearest pullover spot so I can see what the hell just hit my rig and see if there's any damage. Once I find a spot and turn off, I hit my brakes and I hop out. I walk around to the other side and I see a large dent in the back of my trailer. What the fuck? I say to myself. As I walk over to inspect the rear of the trailer, it's a huge dent, at least 5 feet wide and tall. No real shape to it, just a general dent. I can't imagine what could have hit me. My first thought was maybe a boulder rolled down from the side of the hill and smashed into me, but I didn't think I was driving next to any hills or mountains. As far as I knew, it was flat desert all around. I hear the sound of dirt crunching under footfall behind me. I turn around. My breath catches in my throat and my stomach drops as I see something standing not 50 feet away from me. It's large, menacing, and white. I can't even find the words to describe what this thing looked like. It looked like a very large dog, and that's a stretch. It stood on 2 short, stout legs, with long forearms reaching down past its knees. Its shoulders were broad and heaving, as if it had just ran a marathon. Its head was mostly shaped like a wolf, with a large snout filled with razor-sharp teeth, bared in a snarl, saliva dripping from its maw. Its jet black eyes bore right through me, filled with hatred and hunger. I was frozen in place. This creature stood between me and my only salvation, my truck. We stared at one another for a moment until I broke the silence. "You are one ugly motherfucker," I said. It snarled at me. Then, very unexpectedly, it turned and walked away slowly using all 4 of its limbs, receding into the bushes and into the night. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, wondering if it would jump out and feed on my flesh at any moment. It never came back. I ran around the front of my truck and jumped inside, locking the door quickly and flooring it, as fast as you can floor an 18-wheeler. I was soon back on the highway and barreling down it as if my life depended on it. For a while it felt like it did. Within a half hour, I found myself at the truck stop and shut down for the night. Sleep was hard to come by that night. I was certain every noise I heard was that damn creature returning. I managed to close my eyes and drift off to sleep without waking up to another incident. I'm pretty sure I saw a skinwalker 40 years ago. Alex, Jim, and I decided to go camping. We set up camp and lit a fire. We pretty much decided to just drink and talk, and that's what we did all night. About anything and everything came to mind. It was 3 a.m., and we were all still chatting away until we heard something in the trees. Some kind of cracking sound. "Could be a bird," said Jim. "Big damn bird," I replied, with slight confusion. "Could be a monkey," joked Alex. We shared a laugh and ignored the sound and continued to talk. Another half hour had passed, and the sound had completely stopped. "I wonder what that was anyway," Alex said, pretty much out of nowhere. "Well, I've no clue," I replied, taking a sip of my beer. "Well, I hope it's gone because I need to piss," Jim said, standing up and heading to the trees. A few minutes passed, and Alex and I grew concerned. "We best go look for him," said Alex. He sounded a little annoyed. We stood up and walked in the direction Jim went. It didn't take long to find the first drop of blood, and then the trail that led deeper into the woods. "What the fuck?" I said, shaking. We began shouting for Jim, following the trail. I was the first to see him, stood in a clearing about 10 meters away. He was facing away from us. We tried shouting, but we got no response. We walked closer, and we noticed him twitching violently. He was drenched in blood, and clearly quite beat up. I was about to say his name once again, but the word got stuck in my throat when I saw a bloody pile of meat on the floor next to him. I think Alex saw it too, as he also went silent. As if by magic, Jim turned to us. We could also see a burning orange eye and part of a wide mouth with long, sharp teeth where the skin was peeled off. Other than this, Jim looked normal, aside from a few cuts and bruises. As we stared into the single orange eye, the thing wearing Jim's skin pushed the peeling flesh back on, and there Jim stood, totally normal. "Hey guys, let's go for a walk," he said in his normal voice. The thing also seemed to demonstrate excitement. Alex and I turned. We ran past our campsite and got straight in the car parked about a mile from our tent. I'm not sure if Jim followed us. I swear I could hear thumping footsteps behind Alex and I, but I could have imagined it. We reached the car and jumped in, pouring sweat and heaving. I started it faster than ever before and drove at nearly 100 miles per hour all the way back home. When we arrived and got out, I walked around the back of the car, only to see scratch marks on the bumper. I shivered as I realized how close he must have been. This was over 40 years ago. Alex never quite recovered, and last I heard, he was living in a mental hospital. I thought I may have to join him, as I'm pretty sure I saw Jim a few weeks ago at a bar. I thought I was mad until I did some research. I would have done it sooner, but I'm an old man now, and we didn't have Google back in the day. I'm pretty sure we encountered a skinwalker, and it may have found me after 40 years. I think it wants to finish the job. And now it's pretty strange that I keep getting letters asking to catch up from my old friend Jim. I was a kid when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. Driving back on a dirt road about 30 miles per hour, I had this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't!" I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest, then completely stopped when I heard a tap tap on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on and thought it was over till our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me and don't turn away," over and over again. Then I heard it again, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe, and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed, and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and sighed. It was quiet besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, so the evil will forget our faces. I remember curling up on the seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time, listening to my uncle sing an old Navajo prayer till we got to my grandmother's house. I called my uncle because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit. He said, I didn't see faces, just eyes. Like brake lights you see on the road. It watched you. Before hanging up, I tried joking with him about it. Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back? No laughter, just a pause. Because it wasn't alone. My possible skinwalker encounter. I went to camp when I was about 14. I'm an avid hiker and love to go backpacking, so I found a camp where we would do a 125-mile, 15-day trek over in Montana. After about a 17-hour drive from Minnesota, we finally got there and started our hike. It all started out as normal as could be. Hard as hell at first because it was uphill and I had about a 50-pound pack, but after a couple of days we all started to get this weird feeling like something was just wrong. We assumed we were just homesick and kinda just brushed it off. After about another day, we were taking a break and it got damn near silent in the woods. And if you go camping in the woods, you should know this is not normal. Since we were in Montana, we assumed it was probably a bear. So we banged some pots as we walked and had our bear spray ready, but couldn't shake this uneasy feeling like we shouldn't be there. After we had finally got to the next site, we had felt a little bit better and set up our tents. All went fine until dinner time, until we saw a deer. It's Montana, so it's not surprising, but it was so skinny and looked like it had a broken leg. But it smelled like death and just looked plain wrong. We had managed to make enough noise to scare it off, but it didn't run off like its leg was hurt. It ran off just like everything was normal. After that, we were all uneasy but exhausted and got ready to go to sleep. So we got in our tents and nodded off. I woke up to my tent mate Tyler shaking me, and before I could ask why, he pointed to the front of our tent. The moon was out, so we had good light and I could see what looked like a deer through the tent canvas, but you could tell it was just off. Its body was freakishly long, and it seemed to be on 2 legs. It was just passing around the tents, making this disturbing, chittering noise, which wasn't a normal noise that a deer would make. After about 15 minutes of this, it finally seemed to have left, but the sound got unbearably loud for a few seconds before it went into eerie quietness. Needless to say, we didn't go back to sleep. The next morning, we got the fuck out of that area after seeing tracks go from deer to a weirdly shaped foot. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched until we got off the trail. Since this happened, I have not returned to the woods without some sort of firearm. And whenever I'm up north, I can't shake this feeling that I'm always being watched. The one day I woke up late may have saved my life. I've told this story in other places, on other accounts before, but it bears repeating. One day, when I was an elementary schooler, I think probably 3rd or 4th grade, I was awoken by my mom in a rush. She had overslept, and since she always woke me up in the morning, this meant that I too overslept. And now there was just no way I was going to be ready for school early enough to get on the school bus. If I recall, school started at 8 a.m. and my bus pickup was at 7 a.m., but it was already like 6:40 or something, and I was still in my pajamas and hadn't even had breakfast yet. So my mom decided that today we would just tell the bus driver to go on ahead and she would take me to school, which would give me plenty of time to get ready. So I'm sitting there at the dining room table eating breakfast, still in my pajamas, and it's now about 6:50. We hear the bus pull up, about 10 minutes earlier than usual. My mom peeks her head out of the door into the foggy morning and waves the school bus on. She closes the door and comes back inside, but the bus doesn't pull away. There's a knock at the door, and Mom opens it to find a man in a bus driver uniform. He explains that he's a substitute driver because the regular driver called in sick. He says he knows he's a few minutes early since he wanted to get an early start on the route that he didn't know so well. Mom explains to him that she was going to take me to school since we woke up late. He gets visibly upset and says that he could wait a few minutes since he's already running ahead of schedule. My mom insists that no, I won't be ready to go in a few minutes, and tells him to go on ahead. He seemed angry about this, but turned around and got back in the bus and left. I returned to eating my breakfast, and I still don't have my school clothes on at this point. But at 7 a.m., another bus pulls up to the house. Mom thinks it's weird and goes outside to talk to them. She comes back inside looking terrified, but doesn't really say anything about it and tells me to finish getting ready for school. At the time, I didn't know what happened, but Mom would end up telling me a few years later. When she went to this second bus, she found that it was being driven by my regular bus driver, and it was full of all the other kids that are usually on the route. Mom then asked the driver about the substitute driver and about my regular driver calling in sick. I've never called in sick. There is no substitute driver on my route, he says. The driver immediately called dispatch in a panic and told my mom to go inside and call the police, which she did without me knowing, and to report this incident. There was absolutely no one doing my driver's route that day. Whoever this was most likely a kidnapper who had targeted me. I never heard anything about it again, not even if someone else had ended up being picked up by this mysterious fake bus driver. But chances are, had I gotten on that bus, I would have never made it to school or back home. And if Mom hadn't overslept on that specific day, I would have been on that bus. I got an Amber Alert notification saying do not look at the moon, but thousands of people were texting me, look at the moon, it's beautiful outside. I woke up at 3 a.m. to an Amber Alert notification on my phone. Struggling to find my phone, I turn on the lamp on my nightside stand to find it on the floor. The Amber Alert notification says, do not look at the moon. Please fall asleep and refrain from looking outside. I was a little freaked out by this. What could possibly be wrong with looking at the moon? I became even more confused when I found out that I had thousands of other notifications. My eyes grew wide. I awakened more. I unlocked my phone to find WhatsApp have a little red circle above it saying 99+. All of my social media apps had over 100 notifications. One of the notifications had said, look at the moon, it's beautiful outside. Must have been someone who had gotten the notification and wanted to creep someone out. That's when I found out another notification had said, look at the moon, it's beautiful outside. That's weird. Another person had said the same thing. I scrolled through all of the notifications. To my surprise, every notification said the same thing. Look at the moon. It's beautiful outside. I was freaked out. I wanted to look outside out of curiosity, but I was so creeped out, I didn't. Maybe my phone was hacked. I decided to text my friend to see if he was in the same scenario I was in. However, when I opened up his DMs, all of the previous messages were gone, and there was only one thing on the screen. Look at the moon. It's beautiful outside. I was bewildered. I had to be hacked, right? I texted him anyway. Dude, what's going on? Did you get the Amber Alert notification too? About a minute later, he texted back. Look at the moon. It's beautiful outside. That made me feel less like my phone was hacked. The Amber Alert had told me to just fall back asleep, and so I did. Well, I didn't, but I tried to. I felt haunted from those notifications. I just couldn't sleep. Finally, I got another notification. It's the moon thing, isn't it? I mumbled under my breath. When I opened my phone, I was surprised to see a notification from my other friend Dave. He said, Hey dude, you up? I got a weird Amber Alert notification and thousands of people are texting me. My eyes grew wide. I quickly sat up to text him back. Yeah, you getting the moon thing too? I texted quickly. He responded with, Yeah, I haven't looked at the moon, have you? I responded, No, I don't want to. I'm curious though. He replied, Don't look at it. I don't know what could happen, but it's certainly a bad thing. I got up and decided to turn on my lights and close the curtains, just in case. You know I'm a curious guy, I texted. I feel like I have to. He kept telling me, Don't look at it, it could be bad. He knows that I'm a curious guy. I'm also a risky person. He's also really non-serious. He always dared me to do these risks and see me as a daredevil, which is what I see myself as anyway. However, this time, he wasn't joking. That's how you know he's dead serious. What could possibly happen if I looked at it? Is it so bright that I'll blind my eyes? There's no light out there, I texted. This time, I'm serious, he replied. I couldn't take it. My curiosity was beaming. I turned off the phone. I set it down. I walked to the window, opened the blinds, opened the window, and peeked my head out, looking up. The moon was beautiful. A pretty blue and yellow color made it glow. It was almost a rainbow. The moon was bigger and brighter than usual. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. My phone kept getting notifications. I walked to it. With a huge grin and unfocused eyes, I could see it was Dave saying, Dude, why aren't you responding? Did you look at the moon? I responded, texting him back using nothing but my index finger. Key by key, I said, Look at the moon. It's beautiful outside. Run. And if you can't run, then walk. And if you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, don't stop. It's only been an hour since everyone on Earth, as far as I could tell, heard those same words. I was already walking through the park when I heard them, and after seeing what happens, I won't be stopping anytime soon. It's been 2 hours now. I've kept walking. I'm tired, but stopping is not an option. Some people try driving, but the act of getting in a car requires stopping, even for the briefest moment. And as those already driving when they heard the rules soon found out, it's impossible to move indefinitely in a vehicle, especially in a crowded city. Their screams kept me moving. It's been 4 hours now, and I'm exhausted, with the only thing pushing me forward being the fear of what awaits when I stop. And yes, I mean when. proven by plenty of those around me, eventually I'll have to stop. Some have just given up, accepting their fate only to immediately regret their decision. Some just couldn't take the screams anymore, and most simply don't see the point of continuing. And with every step I take, I'm starting to become more like the latter. It's been about 6 hours now, and for the first time I saw what happens up close. I was walking aimlessly down an alley, trying to get away from the madness, when I saw a young man, no more than 16 years old, crying. It didn't even register at first to me until he made eye contact. He had stopped moving. His eyes were bloodshot, and not just the whites around his pupils, I mean, the entirety of his eyes were crimson red. Black tears streamed down his expressionless face, and then he smiled. A wide, toothy smile that would have screamed of joy if it wasn't followed by animalistic screams that would give the biggest horror fanatic nightmares. I wish I could say witnessing his dying moments was the most horrific thing to happen to me today, but then it hit me. The realization that I had just stopped moving. Terrifying deep web story. Let me start this off by saying that it is imperative that you stay off the dark web. No matter what anyone tells you, no good can come from using it, and I am about to tell you why. I was 15 at the time. I had come home from school on a Friday afternoon, ready to relax, kick back, and enjoy the short break. I had started using code about a year prior, nothing too fancy, just basic Python, Java, HTTPS, etc., and was practicing it daily. Now, I had known about the dark web before this took place. I would sometimes buy weed off of it, but that was the extent of it. This particular day, however, I decided to venture further and really take a look at the dark web. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the iceberg diagram representing the internet's content. For those who don't know, the surface web contains about 10% of the internet's content, while the deep and dark web take up the other 90%. I was ready to see what it really held. I heard stories about what goes down on the deep web: murder, inhumane torture, CP, etc., but I didn't really believe that they were all legit. So I hopped on Tor and began to see what I could dig up. I started off by going on the hidden wiki and browsing through various websites, most of which contained illegal things such as drugs, hackers and hitmen for hire, and lots of CP. I clicked on a random forum link, which took me about a minute to load. I wish I could remember the name of it. It was a forum where people could pick a topic they wanted to talk about, such as politics, dealing with mental health, etc. I noticed one of the topics was a pedo forum, and I don't even want to go into detail on what I saw there. There was one particular one that caught my eye. The link was in all red, while the rest were all black. It said, "Not for the weak, enter at your own risk." Curious as to what this was, I clicked on the link and it brought me to a forum that had only one link on the whole page. I clicked on the link and it brought me to a chat room. I realized that nobody was saying anything in it, only sending links. This set off alarm bells in my head because I had an idea of what was on these links. I wish I had listened to my gut feeling, which was telling me to close out while you still can. However, the ignorant, curious teen took over me, and I started setting up some protection for myself using the code I had learned. I later realized this amateur coding I did would not protect me from these advanced people with malicious intent. I clicked on a random link, and a page loaded surprisingly fast. It looked to be another chat room. I went to type hello or something, but it would not let me. I sighed and began moving my mouse to go to the previous page when a noise went off. I had received a chat. The message said, "Hello, new user. I see that you have found my site. Would you like to continue?" I tried typing again, but I still couldn't. The next message sent chills down my back, and my hands are shaking just recalling it. It read, "No, son, not the keyboard." I tried turning off my computer, but of course, nothing worked. Another message popped up saying, "I guess I'll take that as a no." The screen suddenly changed, and a video began playing. It was a black screen, but I could hear a deep male voice say, "Unfortunately for you, you do not have a choice." I grabbed a sticky note and put it over my webcam, and the voice on the screen said, "Ah, so we're playing games now, huh?" The video then began to change, and I realized the man was taking his hand off the camera. He was a short man, maybe about 5'2", but that brought me no comfort. He held up a knife and said, "Name any body part." I then, for the first time, noticed a cloth in the corner of the room, covering something up, which I could only assume to be a body. I finally had enough. I unplugged my computer and lay on the floor, panting for hours until I could finally get up. I now suffer from anxiety and won't touch a computer unless I have to. Just be safe out there, guys. I, 17 female, work in a movie theater. I am usually the cashier, but sometimes I have the responsibility of cleaning the theater. Anyways, one night, my boss told me that I would be responsible for cleaning because some of the staff went home early. I was a bit annoyed because I was super tired and the time was already 12:34 a.m., but I needed the money and I only needed to clean 3 theaters. I packed up my cleaning supplies and made my way to Theater 12. I opened the door and started sweeping up all of the popcorn. I then started wiping the seats. After about 15 minutes, I was done. I packed up my supplies and started walking toward Theater 16. I cleaned up all the spills and popcorn grease that was on the seats. After 20 minutes, I was done cleaning. Then, I walked to Theater 4. I opened the door and started sweeping up the popcorn on the floor. As I was sweeping, I heard a giggling sound. Right when I looked up, the giggling stopped. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. I then yelled, "Is anyone in here?" But no one answered. So I yelled, "No one is supposed to be here." I was getting annoyed, but I decided to forget about it and started wiping the seats in the first row. After a few seconds, I heard the same giggling sound. I stood there and listened. At this point, I was pissed. The giggling sound slowly started turning into cackling. I was creeped out, but I was also mad. I yelled out in an angry voice, "Who's here?" But I got no response. I started walking up the stairs, and as I was walking up, the cackling sound got louder and louder. I started to think of the worst scenarios. I was no longer mad because all the anger was replaced with fear. Right when I got to the 10th row, the cackling stopped. I was super freaked out. I held my breath so I wouldn't make any noise. I started to turn around because I was really scared and just wanted to get out of the theater. Right when I turned around, I heard the cackling sound again. I turned back around and looked up the stairs, but I still couldn't see anyone or anything. It was too dark. I started walking back up the stairs and eventually made it to the last row, which was the 16th row. There was a small gap behind the seats and the wall. It was about a 1-foot gap. The cackling was so loud and obnoxious. I turned my head to look into the gap. It was dark, but I could still see the face of a creepy guy. He was crouched down and staring up at me. He had a big smile on his face. Right when we made eye contact, he stopped cackling. He raised his finger to his lip and whispered, "Shh." And after a couple of moments of silence, he said, "Boo." Right when he said that, I screamed. I turned around and ran down the stairs. He tried to grab me, but he missed. He chased me down the stairs. He was cackling and screaming. I eventually made it to the big wooden doors. I opened them and closed it in his face. I ran to one of the employees and told him about the man. The employee called the police. A few minutes later, the police arrived and went into the theater. 5 minutes later, the cops came out with a man in handcuffs. The man was cackling and screaming. He was wearing dirty clothes and had long, greasy hair. Turns out, this man was a serial killer. He has killed 5 total people, and he was planning on killing me that night too, but I escaped. A few weeks later, I quit that job. Please return to your workstation. Brandon Thompson, please return to your workstation. Brandon Thompson, please return to your workstation. The intercom echoed. It was another Friday night, one that I wouldn't be able to enjoy since I had to work, although it wasn't the worst job I could have in the plant. I'm employed in a rather large company that makes medical equipment. There are about 14 production lines in the large concrete building that run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. My position is driving around on a riding forklift we refer to as a horse. I bring pallets of supplies that the lines need and take finished pallets of product away. Pretty simple stuff, but 12 hours of it takes a toll on you, and on the night shift at that. Even after 2 years of doing the same thing, I'm lucky if I manage a meager 6 hours of sleep while the sun bleeds through my blackout curtains. Still, it pays well, much better than any other place in my small town. So, like the rest of my coworkers, I plaster on that fake smile every shift and do my best to make it through the next morning. Accidents would happen, of course. Usually never anything major, but once in a great while somebody would screw up so badly they had to make a safety video about them. It was a few months ago when Jerry, one of our mechanical engineers, was up on the ladder fixing a product jam on the ceiling conveyor. He had just about gotten it straightened out when his weight shifted wrong and the ladder came out from below him. This wouldn't have been so bad were it not for the wedding ring on his finger. It got caught between some metal and it came sliding off, along with the skin of his ring finger. Needless to say, production in the area came to a stop. Staff that were trained for medical emergencies came rushing over to the howling man and worked to try to stop some of the bleeding. There was a lot. Seeing the skin still hanging from the conveyor like a bloody used contraceptive, one of the staff propped up the ladder and made sure to grab it, as if it could be sewed back on. That was a pretty messy day for our little factory, and since then, absolutely no jewelry was allowed on the floor. Instances like this were pretty rare though, and usually the worst would be a scrape or a slammed finger. Of course, we had to watch a new safety video and go through more computer training on the situation, but things went back to normal. I drove around on my horse, listening to the intercom call people back to their workstations, for me to bring various lines, certain products, or once in a while some joker who thought they were being funny, play music from their phone on it. It was last week that the next serious accident happened, much worse than someone having the skin of their finger slewed off. David, from the parts department, was in the process of lifting a pallet of motors up to his area on the second floor. They were planning on installing a few new lines in the near future, I think. I'm not sure. Anyway, Brandon Thompson was walking through the hall where David was, like an idiot, decided to walk directly under the raised pallet. The motors themselves weren't properly wrapped, and when the forks hit the next level, the pallet bounced. I had the misfortune to witness the 100-pound motors come tumbling down. Some landed on the top cage of the lift, protecting David. Others slammed hard on the top of Brandon, taking him down before he had a chance to yelp. I was stunned seeing this gruesome scene before me. Blood was splashed along the walls and floor like crimson ribbons. Pink brain matter oozed out from the torn in half skull. His limbs lay below the still crushing weight of the motors, pushed up in sickening angles. Someone in the distance was screaming, and I wanted to yell at them to shut up. Then I realized it was me. There was a lot that happened at that point, but it was so fast I couldn't really make sense of it all. I'm pretty sure I disassociated as I looked on. People came running over. More people screamed. My throat was on fire from throwing up, and poor David slipped on some of Brandon as he tried to get out of the forklift. Someone put their arm around mine and pulled me away to the front offices. I was allowed to go home, but I would have to write up an incident report in the next day or two. The whole thing messed me up pretty bad, but doing that seemed to help me out quite a bit. A week went by, and some of us were able to return to work. Others, mostly good friends of Brandon, stayed home, still grieving from the loss. I didn't know Brandon that well, and I was thankful for that. Still, every time I see the now much cleaner spot on the floor where he died, I couldn't help but feel sorry for the guy. Work went on pretty much as usual. Lines would need stuff brought to them, and finished pallets needed to be taken away. The intercom would spout off, telling people to return to their workstation, and the odd song would ring out. I was getting ready to go to my first break when I heard it. "Brandon Thompson, please return to your workstation. Brandon Thompson, please return to your workstation." What the hell? I thought to myself. I put it out of my mind and made my way to the cafeteria when I heard it again. "Brandon Thompson, please return to your workstation. Brandon Thompson, please return to your workstation." I saw David in the cafeteria and sat in the seat across from him. "What's up with that?" I asked. He chewed his sandwich thoughtfully before answering. "It's just a last call, kind of a way of honoring Brandon and stuff like that." "It's a little weird, don't you think?" "Nah, man. Wouldn't you want people to remember you after you died?" "I guess so. I didn't really think about it, to be honest." "Well, best get used to it. We're probably going to be hearing that one for the next week or so." And so it was. The entire night, different voices from across the plant called out for a coworker that would never come. At least I thought. Tonight has been a real cluster. No accidents, thank God, but part of me wishes it were that simple. The first half of the night I drove around, doing my regular rounds, hearing people call out for our dead coworker. It was before lunch when I heard the commotion. Down toward the new side of the building I drove. Footprints led the way, brown and muddy. They were dotted in strange gapes, some close, some far apart like that of a drunken dancer. Ahead of me stood a large crowd, and I got off the horse, making my way through. I saw something that made me sick for a second time. Standing in the ring of people was Brandon. One good leg seemed to hold most of the weight as glistening white bones snapped through the crushed meat of the other. His arm dangled from what remained of sutures, made by the mortuary, I would guess. What remained of his destroyed head and face stared at everyone in a glare of anger. With a mostly toothless mouth, he drew in a shaking, wet breath.
"This place is a bunch of bullshit. I can't even die without being called back into work."
After saying this, the body simply slumped over, and he left us a second time. There's something in my neighborhood. I'm a 16-year-old dude, and this happened a few weeks ago. I'm fairly chill, and I just live with my grandfather on the east side of Kentucky, barely above the Tennessee line. I'm a big guy, and typically I don't do anything particularly bad. I don't smoke, I don't do dip, I don't even drink. To be clear, my grandfather is 76 and has just about beaten some type of leukemia. I'm a welding nerd also. It's the thing I enjoy most at school. Sometimes when I can't sleep, or I wake up in the middle of the night, I put on some clothes and go outside to my shed. My shed is really a spare 2-car garage with metal working equipment inside. I find the sound of the arcs pleasing to my ear when I'm tired, and it can help ease my mind, as I'm a nervous person to begin with. Now, if you're not familiar with eastern Kentucky, it's like a bowl. Mountains surround you 360 degrees, and things like coyotes and snakes are common to see rummaging around at night. They don't really scare me, because the path to my shed is well lit and concrete. I have a few windows in the building. All but 2 are broken out from stupid shit I did as a little kid inside the shop. It is actually brighter than my bedroom. There's plenty of light, so I turned my ventilation on, set up my welder, and started welding on some scrap metal to practice the 3F position, also known as vertical welding. I do this a lot, and no one really minds as my ventilation system is rather quiet, and you'd have the hearing of a bat to notice it in the other house. I'm sat there in my metal stool, and something is wrong. I'm a pretty talented welder by nature. It comes as natural to me as breathing. So when my welds looked shaky and there was spatter everywhere, I knew something was wrong. My welder was set right, so I hadn't bumped it with my knee when welding. I heard something, like a cowbell. My neighbor has a cow in his yard, so I figured she got out. It happens quite a lot. So I looked outside and didn't see her anywhere. This isn't a calf. This is a nearly full-grown cow that weighs upward of 1,200 pounds. They don't just vanish into thin air. I checked another window, and I could barely see anything. My shed may be bright, but the trees block most of that light at night. But I did see something. Now, I kinda wish I hadn't seen. It was deformed, weird and long. It had fur. So I thought I was just looking at a coyote pack, but no. This thing was too big to be a coyote, or a wolf, and too skinny to be a bear. Imagine the stereotypical Bigfoot and starve him. That's what this thing looked like. Somehow it was more greasy and horrible than when I first thought. I turned my welder off and then ran back into my house. I grabbed a flare gun and headed back outside. Looking back on this, I really don't know why I didn't grab my grandfather's rifle. I have a hunting permit, and this thing is on my property. Somehow in my head, shooting a flare at it was the best idea since inventing electricity. So I opened the window, took aim, and shot a flare at the thing. I don't think I regret anything more than I regret that. It looked up, and its face was horrifying. Like a bulldog, its face was scrunched up and small, protruding out just enough to notice. And to make it all worse, it was on a big round head. It looked at me, howled a screech, and ran. I guess the flare was as scary to it as it was to me. I found out that my neighbor's cow had had the bell stolen off of it and had been scratched deeply in the neck, back, and at the legs. I told everyone about what I saw, and what worries me now is that another neighbor of mine claims to have seen it too, It took a chicken of his. There is something in my house. I'm not sure how it started, but every night when I go to bed, I hear strange noises coming from my kitchen. It's like there's someone in there, but every time I go to check, there's no one. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the sounds were so vivid and real that I couldn't just ignore them. The first few nights I brushed it off and tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the old pipes in the house or maybe just the wind outside. But as the nights passed, the sounds only grew louder and more frequent. It sounded like something was moving around, banging on the counters and opening and closing drawers. One night, I finally got up the courage to go investigate. I tiptoed through the dark house, my heart pounding in my chest, and cautiously made my way to the kitchen. As I got closer, the noises grew louder and my nerves were on edge. When I finally reached the kitchen, I flipped on the light switch and gasped in horror. A homeless man was rummaging through my cabinets and drawers. Our eyes met, and he froze for a moment before lunging at me with a knife. I screamed and ran as fast as I could back to my bedroom, heart racing with fear. I could hear his footsteps chasing after me, and I knew I had to get out of the house. I managed to grab my phone and dial 911 as I ran down the street, tears streaming down my face. The police had come and gone, searching every corner of my house, but they found no trace of the homeless man. I spent the next few days on edge, afraid that he would come back and finish what he started. But when the next night came, I foolishly thought I was safe. I went to bed and tried to put the whole ordeal out of my mind. However, I woke up in the middle of the night to find the homeless man standing by my bed. My heart stopped. I froze in fear, unable to move or speak. The man spoke first.
"Do you have any food?"
He asked in a raspy voice.
"I'm so hungry."
I was paralyzed with fear. Not knowing what to do, I could see the knife in his hand, glinting in the moonlight. My mind raced with possibilities, but I knew that if I didn't give him what he wanted, he might hurt me. I slowly got up out of my bed and walked to the kitchen, the homeless man following close behind me. I opened the fridge and handed him a carton of milk and some bread. He took them and left without saying another word. I stayed up the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep. The next day, I called the police again, and once more, they searched over my house, but they still found nothing. After that night, I never saw the homeless man again, but the memory of him standing beside my bed, asking for food, with that knife in his hand, still haunts me to this day. I found a tape of a woman being unalived. I was at my grandmother's house, helping my grandmother move furniture around. She became my mother figure after the death of my mother when I was a young child, and I had been staying with her ever since my car accident. My grandmother helped nurse me back into health, so I made an effort to alleviate her of any and all physical tasks. I felt it was the least I could do. It was in the attic when I accidentally knocked over a box. The box was filled with VHS tapes, with the farthest dating back to 1990. All that was written on them was the year. There was a TV in the attic as well, because we used the attic as more like a functioning room than a storage space. So I decided to play the oldest tape. I expected to see happy memories, home videos, scenery, anything other than this. The video starts with whoever is holding the camera filming a woman sitting alone at a small table at a coffee shop. She's reading. The camera was zoomed in on her hair glowing in the light. Fixed. The tape then skips to a new setting in what looks like downtown Chicago somewhere. I can see the back of the same woman from before, walking down the street, oblivious to the person trailing and filming behind her. The sky is now dark gray, I can see lights from passing cars glinting off her shiny boots. The camera is clambering and rubbing up against the jacket of the cameraman. He, or she's, not that far from her, but is far enough away to show that he or she's not with her, clearly stalking her. The scene lasted maybe 5 minutes of the monotonous walking until it shifted to the woman now bound and stowed in the trunk of a car. She was taped up, unable to speak. All I could hear was the sound of heavy rainfall, accompanied by her screaming and crying. Her muffled panic broke my heart in two. My spine became frozen. I couldn't open my eyes any wider. Any moment, the film could shift to something so much more grotesque, so morbid, so life-changing, and I could do nothing but watch in horror. I saw a black-gloved, covered hand sprout from behind the camera, slam the trunk door closed, trapping her inside. It's now clearly night. The next scene skips to the woman, now beaten and bloody, while tied to a chair. The location looks to be a warehouse somewhere, the only light coming from a single fluorescent bulb above the woman, illuminating pools of crimson red blood at her feet. The camera is steadily held, so much that it seems to be propped up by a stand. I can hear the poor woman moaning in pain underneath the tape covering her mouth. I can also hear something shifting around on the concrete, like someone adjusting their stance. It seemed manic. I could hear clambering of metal, like tools being packed or unpacked from a bag. My stomach is now fully turned. The stalker then walks into frame, showing only the back of his head. His head was completely covered in a baklava. He carried a blade in his right hand. My heart completely halted. The stalker held her drooping head up, tilted her face upward, and began to slice her throat from her left ear all the way to the right. She squirmed and gargled in her desperate and useless attempt to survive. I had never seen so much blood in my life. The killer then takes off his mask and stares into the camera, flashing a toothy grin. The film then abruptly stops. I was held in place by my now shot nerves. My blood slowed into stillness, completely discoloring my body into an almost corpse-like white. My grandmother was watching me. She shakenly tried to console me from across the room, struggling to form words through the river of tears streaming down her face. She said she didn't want me to ever be reminded of who I was before my accident. My mother thinks she's dead. My mother has been acting strange lately. She's no longer been her bright, cheery self. She sits in her chair, crouched in a fetal position, as if she's ever walking. She's pacing slowly and shifting her weight from side to side. My dad, sister, and I have been trying to help her get better, but nothing seems to help. We've been trying to get her to talk about what she's feeling, and all she says is she's dead. She never means dead inside, but literally dead. She's asking us how we don't know that. We keep telling her that she isn't dead and that she's right here. She keeps denying this. Mother has been making weird demands, that we find her body, give her a funeral, let her go, that kind of thing. She says she sees her skin decomposing and smells her decaying body in the forest. I keep asking her what she's talking about. She's referring to a night she came home, late after meeting friends. She came home around 11 p.m., and we assumed she lost track of time. The strange thing was that her car is nowhere to be found. We asked her if she walked home, and all she tells us is she died in a wreck. According to her, she slid off the road and her car tipped over. The impact killed her. We've been trying to convince her that she's alive, but nothing is helping. Then I got a call from the police. The officer on the line said that a car was found on the side of the road, tipped over. The person inside, who had been dead for days, fits my mother's description. They wanted someone to come to the morgue and identify the body. I was frozen in fear and uncertainty after hanging up. My mother walked up to me, and I felt a cold draft wafting through my body. "See you at the funeral," was the last thing she said before she evaporated into the thin, cold air. The following story may contain images or topics that others may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. I found my mother's sleep diary, and now I'm afraid of who my father is. I've always wondered about it, where I came from, who I came from, what he was like, what his name was. But every time I brought him up in conversation, my mother would get upset. The older I grew, the more upset she became when I asked. So I stopped altogether. I gave in to the fact that I would never know. The truly sad thing was, she was a very active sleepwalker, and had been her whole life. She'd woken up in other people's homes, in people's cars, even in a 24-hour drugstore. It was a thought I never wanted to entertain, but the possibility my mother sleepwalked into the wrong place and had been taken advantage of was always hiding in the back of my mind. Then my mother passed away. As I was cleaning out her house, I came across a dozen small boxes under her bed. They were filled with notebooks. The front covers of the notebooks had detailed dates spanning 6-month intervals. They started 50 years ago and went up until 30 years ago. There hadn't been anything since. Other than the dates, there was no writing on the covers. Curiosity got me, so I found the first notebook and read its first entry. It was a sleep diary, written by my mother in a tone I've never heard before. She was in love. My whole life, my mother steered clear of men. I had never known her to have even a single boyfriend. But in the sleep diary, she was in love with a man. My mother never spoke his name. She only referred to the man as my love. The first entry spoke of him coming to her in a dream. He spoke in a warm voice through the cold darkness and haze of my mother's clouded mind. The man guided my mother into a bright opening that led into a clearing. There she met the man she referred to as my love. My mother couldn't physically describe him, other than an unimaginable being of beauty, grace, and charm. The man emitted something from every part of his being that sent electric bolts through my mother's body. I skimmed through the diaries and read what turned into a full-blown love story between my mother and this literal man of her dreams. One of the strange things was, it wasn't even sexual. There was just this connection that they had that created a fullness in her soul my mother seemed to have been missing her whole life. She wrote about the two of them spending hours, days, even years, in some utopian paradise. The landscapes were filled with waterfalls and streams, rolling hills and mountains and warm sunlight always shining down. The two would read and eat and drink and swim and experience things she couldn't even begin to explain, involving vast vistas and horizons. Reading it made me feel happy for my mother. Even if it was just all a dream, she really seemed to have found love, even if it was in some kind of way she couldn't find in real life. I didn't read all the notebooks, but I wanted to know how my mother's story ended, so I skipped to the last diary and found the last entry. Their relationship had changed. They were no longer spending their days in a fantastic valley together. The man had been leading my mother into a strange hole in the earth that spiraled downward into a walking tunnel. My mother's hand was always held tightly in the man's, but she would never try to pull away. She'd hated going down into the hole because they would walk for what seemed like hours, continuing to spiral downwards and becoming dizzier and dizzier. But she kept going deeper, and they went further underground. Glowing specters began to move past her. She grabbed a hold of the man, but she didn't feel his grip back. The walls of the tunnel moved, shifting around like a living organism, and the ground under her feet became hot, unbearably hot. Finally, the tunnel reached an opening. There was land for miles covered in thick layers of roaring flames. The man held my mother close, then threw her into the fire. She described the immediate burning as being impossibly painful. A moment later, the man jumped on top of her. but he was no longer a man. He had horrific, red, melting flesh, and he burned her worse than the flames under her. I stopped reading as he began to ravage her. I couldn't bring myself to read about my mother's, even if it wasn't a dream, even if, somehow, it related to my conception. Because that was the other thing. The last entry date was 9 months ago, to the day of my birth. I take photos for national parks. They usually reach out to me to stay in one of their cabins, or just in the area and take pictures of the nature or wildlife. It doesn't pay a whole lot, but I live comfortably when I'm home, and get to travel to a lot of beautiful places all over the country. I get an allowance of food while I'm traveling. It's a good deal. One time, a park reached out to me that I hadn't heard of. It was a smaller state park that was just opening up. They just got their grant, or whatever they needed to protect the park land, and they wanted me to be the one to take the first pictures of the park. They said they would pay me well, and I was pretty excited to see a new park. Not every day that happens. Anyway, I live on the East Coast, and the park was in the South Midwest, and they said they'd pay for my flight, which usually isn't covered. I accepted the offer and took the flight down there. When I arrived, one of the drivers had picked me up. The driver seemed excited to have me there. He was young and told me his name was Mark. He explained he was one of the sons of the people running the park, and I asked a few questions about the size of the scenery of the park. Mark told me it was mostly desert, but that his mom planned on hosting concerts and festivals there a few times a year. They were already starting construction on a few cabins and resource buildings. He keeps talking about all the plans his mom has for the area as I look out the window. Dusty hills and miles of desert stretched out in every direction. Nothing I haven't seen before. A few hours later, we get to the entrance of the park. I meet Mark's mom, and she tells me they have a tent and some equipment set up. She drove me out in a different car, and it takes about 20 minutes to go to the campsite. They had a large tarp set out with a tent and a generator for me, much more nicer than what I was used to. She explains the shots that they're looking for and tells me to call them if I need anything. She says an awkward goodbye and drives off. The sun was already setting, so I got a few shots in for fun. They were looking for day shots, so I read until it got dark and waited for the stars to come out. That was always my favorite part about these trips. Being out in the middle of nowhere, you could see everything. About an hour after the sunset, I heard a series of noises. I disregarded it at first, but when I heard them again, I went outside of my tent to try to see what it was. The noises happened again. It came from multiple directions and sounded like screeching and growling and crying all at once. It was loud, and it was close. It was a noise that made my skin crawl. It was too dark to see past the lantern I had set up in the corner of the tarp, and the generator was still on, so I couldn't determine exactly where the sound was coming from. I turned the light off and switched the generator off too. It took a minute for my eyes to adjust to the darkness, but when they did, I saw them. It was about a dozen people. They were either gray or white and fully naked. They were circling my campsite, running on all fours. When they screamed, their mouths opened wider than any human I'd ever seen, but they looked human. I was frozen, but they circled my tent at least 20 times. I didn't know what to do. They would scream every so often. I didn't even think to grab my camera. Then, they all stopped, faced directly at me, and screamed one last time, louder and longer than before. When they finished, they left. All of them. They ran off into the desert on all fours. I made my way back into the tent, confused but unable to sleep. When the sun came up, I took the shots that Mark's mom requested and left. She was surprised I had finished so quickly. I told her to be careful at night and made my way back to the airport. I didn't want to explain what I saw. She would have thought I was crazy, and maybe I was. But those sounds still haunt me to this day. The following story may contain images or topics that others may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. My online film student kept filming the same dead oak tree. An online film student named Jacob submitted a video that made me so horrified that I had to call the dean at 1 a.m. She advised me to turn the clip over to the police. I teach filmmaking at an art college in Maryland. During the lockdown in late 2020, my filmmaking course was online. My usual first assignment has the students filming a setting. With an online class, the students just film around their houses. Most students were happy to show off their gaming setup and action figures. A student named Jacob put his camera on a tripod and filmed a dead oak tree in his backyard for about 5 minutes. For continuity editing, I normally have the students film a chase sequence or a snowball fight. For online students, they just film themselves cooking or playing with their pets. Jacob submitted a video of himself tying a noose. He then hung a mannequin on the same dead oak tree. I started to get creeped out, but I had to put on a brave face. Horror and film students always go hand in hand. I don't want to appear like I was easily spooked. For the next assignment, Jacob submitted a clip of a man wearing a medieval jester costume and a smiling mask, dancing around a dead oak tree. It was in black and white and was beyond disturbing. I'm used to horror movies being submitted to me by students, but those were gory and wild and fun. This clip was just eerie. After class, Jacob messaged me privately and asked if I was sick of seeing the same tree over and over. Against my preference, I said no. If he found a muse which inspired him, then he should stick with it as long as he can. It felt like the right thing to say at the time. I found out from other professors that Jacob began incorporating the dead oak tree into all he did. In photography class, he retouched a photo of a car crash onto a photo of the dead oak tree. In digital illustration class, he drew the dead oak tree with a bunch of people hanging from it. Meanwhile, an aspiring YouTuber named Matt asked me if he could submit a Let's Play for his assignment. I normally would say no, but because everyone was home in isolation at the time, I thought, why not? Just add a lot of narration. Matt then invited me to watch him play PUBG live on Twitch. When I did, I was amused to see that Jacob was one of his team members. I asked Matt after the stream how he knew Jacob. Matt said that Jacob was his neighbor, only a few houses down the road from him. Matt also told me what happened to Jacob back when they were in middle school. Jacob was home alone, and a man knocked on the door, telling Jacob that he used to live at that house. The man had asked his father to build him a tree house, and just when the father was about to finish it, he fell from the tree and broke his neck. It's been over 2 decades since he moved away, and the man told Jacob he just wanted to see the oak tree again. Jacob didn't let him inside the house, but said that he can go around and look at it in the backyard. Jacob continued to play video games until his parents came home. When they did, they found that the man was hanging from the tree. The semester after, in early 2021, Jacob wasn't taking any of my classes, but a cinematography professor video called me about one of Jacob's videos. The assignment was to light up a night scene, and Jacob just filmed a handheld point-of-view shot of him circling around the tree with a flashlight. She told me she yelled at Jacob for submitting something like that instead of something more professional. Jacob logged off, and she wondered if she had made a mistake. Other students noticed Jacob's obsession with the dead oak tree as well, and started talking to me about it. They told me that Jacob also dropped from all classes. A few days later, at about 11 p.m., Matt was live streaming and I watched him on Twitch. I was shocked to see Jacob burst through Matt's bedroom door. He was covered in cuts and bruises. Shards of glass were all over his body, and his shirt was soaked in blood. Fresh blood was still dripping down from his forehead. Matt fell out of his chair screaming at the top of his lungs, rightfully freaking out. I'll give Matt credit for not cursing and chasing Jacob out of his room. Matt asked Jacob what was wrong. Jacob looked into the camera and asked if I am watching. He told me to check the video he submitted. There were about 20 people in the chat. Some of them were my students. I added a dependable student in the chat asking her to call 911 and told Matt to render basic first aid to Jacob. Just when I was about to call the police myself, I got a notification that someone had uploaded a large video file to our department's file storage. I opened it, and it was a video clip said to be uploaded by Jacob's username. It showed Jacob placing a camera on the backseat of his car. He turned from his driver's seat and stared into the camera. My mouth was wide open when I saw Jacob, without turning back around to face forward, just step on the gas and crash into the dead oak tree. Once a bustling office building, now stood an eerie structure with an ominous elevator at its core. The building had been abandoned for years, but rumors still circulated about the elevator that kept going down and never stopped. One dark and stormy night, a group of teenagers decided to explore the abandoned building. They heard the rumors about the elevator and wanted to see if they were true. They entered the building and found the elevator at the end of a long hallway. The doors opened with a creak, and they stepped inside. Now, this elevator only had one button, the down arrow. The teenagers pressed it, and the elevator began to descend. They felt a strange sensation in their stomachs as the elevator went down and down, deeper than they ever thought possible. The floors blurred past them, and the darkness outside grew more intense. Suddenly, the elevator jolted to a stop. The teenagers looked at each other, startled. They pressed the button to go back up, but nothing happened. The elevator was stuck. They tried to pry the doors open, but they wouldn't budge. They were trapped. The only thing they could do was wait for help to arrive. They huddled together, trying to stay warm in the chilly elevator. Hours passed, but no one came. The elevator remained stuck, and the darkness outside grew even more ominous. They heard strange noises coming from the shaft, as if something was moving in the darkness below. Suddenly, the elevator began to move again, but not up. It just kept going down, and even deeper than before. The teenagers screamed as they felt themselves falling, their stomachs lurching with each passing floor, but the elevator never stopped. It kept going down and down until they reached the very bottom of the shaft. The doors opened, revealing a dark and foreboding chamber. The teenagers hesitated for a moment, but then curiosity got the best of them, and they stepped out. The chamber was filled with strange machines and equipment covered in dust and cobwebs. There was a strange glow emanating from a corner of the room, and the teenagers cautiously approached it. As they got closer, they saw a figure standing in the corner, its face shrouded in darkness. They called out to it, but it didn't respond. They moved closer, and the figure suddenly turned around, revealing a face twisted with madness. The teenagers screamed and tried to run back into the elevator, but it was gone. They were trapped in the chamber with the madman, and they knew they would never leave. They were doomed to spend eternity in the depths of the abandoned building. The years passed, and the teenagers were indeed still trapped in the depths of the abandoned building, slowly losing their minds as they tried to find a way out. The madman in the corner tormented them every day, taunting them with his insane ramblings and strange experiments. One by one, the teenagers succumbed to the darkness, their minds unraveling as they were consumed by fear and despair. But one teenager refused to give up. He held on to his sanity, even as the world around him crumbled. Day after day, he searched for a way out, trying to find a weakness in the chamber's walls or ceilings, but the walls were far too thick, and the ceiling was way too high. He had no tools, no weapons, and no hope. Desperate, he turned to the only thing he had left, his 2 hands. He began to dig, clawing at the gravel and dirt with his fingers, tearing away at the earth with every ounce of strength he had left. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. His hands bled and blistered, but he kept digging, only sustaining himself by eating the worms and insects that he dug up. He was driven by fierce determination to escape. His fingers started to become mangled and deformed, his bones grinding against each other as they scraped away at the earth, but he never gave up. He kept digging through pain and exhaustion, through hunger and thirst, until one day, his hands broke through the surface. He had tunneled his way out, using nothing but his own willpower and his unyielding determination to survive. He stumbled out into the daylight, blinking in the bright sun as he breathed in fresh air for the first time in years. His hands were nothing but lumps of bone and tendons, twisted and gnarled from months of digging, but he had made it. He had managed to escape the elevator that kept going down and never stopped, and he had done it with nothing but his own 2 hands. He walked away from the abandoned building, his mind scarred by the horrors he had witnessed, but his spirit unbroken, his will to survive stronger than ever. The Silent Boy. A friend and classmate of mine got sick, so today at school, they assigned me the Silent Boy for a project. He never says more than he has to. He only answers the teacher's questions. He won't even talk to the other people or say hello. I admit it's scary. I like mysteries, and I want to find out something about him. Hi. I'm sitting down next to him. He doesn't even look at me. He's nodding his head and jotting down notes in his workbook. We have a project here. I've got a bunch of activities at school, so I thought you'd come over to my place tonight and we could just take a look at it. He sounds disapproving. Disagree? You come to me. He is handing me a torn piece of paper from his workbook with his address and time that I'm supposed to come over. There's also a note telling me to use the back entrance. Are you serious? Totally. He's getting up, packing his things, and leaving. He doesn't give me a single glance the whole time. Laughter echoes through the whole class, with catchphrases like, "You're not coming home alive today. I wouldn't want to be in your shoes." I'm standing in front of his house. It's a bungalow surrounded by plants, but it doesn't look like a jungle. It seems more like a stand of death. The plants look deadly. According to the instructions on the note, I should take the back entrance. Well, okay. I'm walking past the bungalow and don't see any back entrance. There's just a boarded up basement entrance. I'm staring at it, my heart pounding, a million scary thoughts in my head. Boom! The old dusty cellar door swings open. I see the deadly pale and exhausted classmate's face in the darkness. His shaggy, angular black hair adds to the eerie atmosphere. His head is urging me to enter without a word. I'm stepping inside and shivering all over. The door slams, and we are standing in the darkness. A blinding light comes on, and I am momentarily blinded. Water? He grunts. Yes, please. He's walking away, and I'm quickly reaching into my backpack and taking out instruments and a workbook. I am placing them on the table with his things, but my head's spinning with nerves, and I'm dropping his and my stuff on the floor. I hear footsteps returning. I'm quickly picking up my things off the ground. His and my workbook are the same. Which one is mine? I'm opening one of them, and on every page there's a different date and a photo of another person with a frightened expression, a scrunched up face, and death in the eyes. It looks like the last moment of their lives. The final page has today's date, no photo yet. I feel sorry for him, but my personal project takes precedence. I'm curious to see what kind of grimace he will put on. My friend works for the city's CCTV archives and has seen some disturbing things. I hadn't seen Mike in a few months. He'd been buried in work, and our usual weekend nights out had about disappeared. Then he called me on a Thursday and invited me over for drinks. I jumped at the invite, but took note of how depressed he sounded on the phone. By the time I got there, Mike had already started drinking and was slurring his words. A dark cloud seemed to hover over him, which got worse as we drank. I finally asked what had been going on with him. Mike turned darker, afraid. He said it had to do with work. I never really knew what Mike did for a living. I didn't know he worked for the city in the tech department and was involved with the CCTV surveillance network, but I never knew what his day-to-day operations were, which he began to describe in detail. Mike explained there were thousands of cameras scattered throughout his downtown core, outlying neighborhoods, and well into the suburbs for our 1 million plus city. His responsibility was to categorize and archive all the incoming footage. Most of the footage went into very general classifications and were saved in hard drive farms and identified with a lengthy combination of numbers and letters for categorical archiving. They were truly meant to be forgotten about. It was an expansive task, but Mike designed and built an AI screening program that detected common patterns in footage, then sectioned out anomalous behavior for review. The vast majority wasn't noteworthy, something like 99.99%. Then there was the 0.01%. Car accidents, assaults, swarmings, R-words, abductions, murders. Those went into a special archive for use in criminal investigations. And then there was the 0.0001%. They were held in a classified archive and contained footage capturing events for all accounts were unexplainable. This was called the Tartarus Archive. I had afterwards looked up the word Tartarus and discovered it was one of the darkest, deepest prisons from Greek mythology. It was said that if you dropped an anvil from heaven, it would take 7 days for it to reach Earth. It would take another 7 days for the anvil to reach Tartarus. It was the place you sent titans when there was nowhere else that could contain them. When Sisyphus was condemned to an eternity of futility and frustration with a large boulder and a mountain slope, that punishment was carried out in Tartarus. As it turned out, the name was quite fitting to the archive's growing contents. Some footage could be simplified to strange optical anomalies in the camera and coincidences of light or crackheads on a bender through subway systems. Other footage, though, defied logic. The others are what captured Mike's mind that evening. He'd been breaking protocol and bringing hard drives home at night. In fact, he'd been splicing the footage together, capturing and compiling repeat aberrations and editing them into a linear sequence. Mike wanted to show me some. It wasn't in a bragging or showing off kind of way. It felt more like sharing a heavy burden kind of way. I asked if showing me would get him in trouble, but he waved that idea away. I said, "Yeah, obviously I want to see what's going on in my city." Mike led me into his workroom, where he had monitors and towers and piles of externals set up. We sat down and skimmed through some drives nervously. Then he landed on one. Mike told me this anomaly was codenamed Lincoln Spectre. He pressed play. On the largest screen, black and white footage started up, showing Lincoln Avenue, one of our less attractive downtown streets, at 3 a.m. The camera angle showed the length of Lincoln Avenue as it led into the downtown core. The street appeared empty and quiet. From a side road, a woman emerged, walking toward the camera. As she approached the intersection, she turned over her shoulder and appeared to scream. The woman took off, sprinting past the camera, which cut to a new, wider angle from another camera across the street. We watched the woman running frantically, seemingly being chased, but she was the only one on the street. There was no one else anywhere around her. The woman kept screaming as she ran, and the cameras kept following, cutting between different CCTV angles. We watched as this woman was chased into the middle of an empty intersection. She fell, then cowered as if something massive was standing over her. The woman's neck stiffened, and she began to levitate off the ground. Her body looked like a rag doll as something lifted her up by her throat until she was floating a dozen feet above the road, in the middle of an intersection. Then the woman's head snapped to the left, and her body fell back to the ground. The video ended and went black. I sat, shocked. Mike saw my expression and said, "You ain't seen nothing yet." I asked if that was real, if what I saw was unaltered, if it was raw footage. Mike said all he'd done was put the clips together. None of the content had been touched. He told me he found out the incident ended up being described as a hit and run, and the case was left figuratively open for more evidence to amass, which it never would. The department kept the footage hidden, claiming it was a camera malfunction. No one outside of Mike and his boss had seen the video of how the poor woman actually died. I started to understand the air of somberness Mike was carrying around. Mike started the next video. This one was codenamed Black Crab and was much longer than the previous one. It started in the subway systems, at the underground Walkley station, shortly after closing up for the night. Walkley was the last stop on the route, and the exterior was shouldered by a new housing development on one side and untouched forest and swampland on the other. The camera was pointed down along the subway platform on the east side and showed its entire length with benches and garbage cans populating it. At the far end, the tunnel was filled with darkness. The lights on the platform shut off and the station went dark. The camera switched to night vision and everything became visible again. My eyes trained on the platform, waiting for something to happen. Finally, there was movement. It was coming from the tunnel. It was difficult to identify what exactly it was at first, as its movements were strange and the footage was grainy. But it got closer to the camera, and I got a better look. It resembled a human, a man, but he was walking on his hands and feet, upside down, with his back arched and his stomach pointed to the ceiling. He had long dark hair that dragged along the ground, and he wore tattered layers of old jackets and torn pants. He moved like a crab. Jerkily, yet quickly and easily, made his way to the staircase. The footage cut to a new camera in a dark hallway leading out to the stairs of the station. We watched the crab walker claw up 2 steps at a time, and then crawl over the turnstiles and towards the exit. The footage cut again, now showing the exterior of the station entrance. The crab walker squeezed and twisted and maneuvered his body through the locked and closed entrance gate. It looked impossible to accomplish, but he did it. Once outside, the crab walker eyed his surroundings before skittering off towards the woods and disappearing. The footage cut to an hour later and revealed the crab walker reappearing from the woods. He was dragging a small animal by the tail in his teeth, The animal looked like a cat. The crab walker squeezed back through the gate, crawled through the station, and disappeared into the subway tunnel. Again, Mike saw my expression and told me there was more. He showed me the length of the video, which was over an hour long. Mike had compiled over 20 sequences of the crab walker creeping out of the subway station and into the woods. Mike skimmed through the video towards the end, and we watched the crab walker come out of a sewer in a downtown alley. It crawled over to a pile of garbage bags and cardboard boxes. Then it jumped into them, and some kind of vicious frenzy ensued. There was someone else in the pile of garbage. Hands and feet thrashed about as if they were struggling for their life. Then the movement stopped, and the hands and feet went still. The crab walker's body moved jerkily about, but I couldn't see what was happening because of the darkness and all the garbage bags and boxes obscuring the camera's view. Mike leaned over to me and whispered that the crab walker was eating a homeless man. This caused a criminal investigation, as the dead body was found mutilated and festering in the open alleyway. Mike followed up on the inquiry. What he discovered was the crab walker, who authorities believed to be a man named David Fletcher. Decades ago, David had been a prominent lawyer with a family. One Christmas, there was a house fire, and his wife and kids were killed in the blaze. It was David's fault. He lost everything, including his mind. Everyone has a breaking point, whether they know it or not. A place where they bend too far and then snap. David had found his. Family and friends describe his descent as nightmarish. David lived on the streets, became addicted to drugs, and tumbled into mental illness. The last anyone knew of him was from 10 years prior. He'd thrown himself in front of a subway at the Walkley station, and no one heard from him or saw him again. It appeared that somehow, David had survived the subway hit. His back had been broken and healed strangely, causing him to move the way he did. He'd adapted to the new posture and lived in the darkness of the subway tunnels, finding sustenance from drain water and the wild animals he caught. That was what Mike found out, at least. But then he said, that was just the answer the investigators gave in Discovery. Who knows where the truth lay? Mike said there was always an answer for the videos he saw. Whether the answers were true or not, no one knew. But the ones that had to become public all needed explanations, however absurd. Either way, David was never found and didn't reappear on the subway footage. Mike plugged a new hard drive in. He poured a fresh drink and told me this was the one that was troubling him. The file was codenamed Cloud Mirror. I wasn't sure I wanted to see it, but before I could object, Mike pressed play. All the monitors lit up with footage from different intersections downtown on the exact date and time as each other. There were 5 monitors total. The streets on each screen were empty and quiet, no cars or people. Suddenly, at the exact same time in the center of the intersections, a small glow pulsed into existence. It was some kind of orb, roughly the size of a bowling ball. The streetlights around it pulsed with energy waves as the orb grew larger. It grew to the size of a beach ball. Then it flashed out. The streetlights went back to normal, and the intersection was as lifeless as it was before. I asked Mike what they were. He told me he had gigs of footage of the orbs and had watched them repeatedly. He didn't know what they were. At first. Then they started to change. Mike clicked onto the next video. Again, the 5 monitors lit up with the same intersections and time of night, but several weeks later. The streetlights glowed and pulsed, and an orb manifested into existence again. It grew into its beach ball size, but then altered its surface and glow. Something gas-like replaced it, growing outward into a couch-sized cloud of dark gray. One of the cameras was closer, so I got to see the small clouds in detail. It looked like a volcanic eruption wrapping around itself. They were large, constantly morphing blobs that curled outward from a glowing center, resembling a mandible fractal as a gaseous-based organism. It was fascinating to see them floating in the middle of the street, so alien to our roads and stoplights and street lamps. Then they began to move. Gliding down empty roads, the cameras cut to different angles, following the clouds on some unknown path, zigging and zagging onto the new streets and through alleyways. Then they'd stop. The clouds hovered in the center of the intersection. They'd lower to ground level, standing straight up like a large coffin. Holding rigid to the shape, their exteriors continued to shift and mold together like magnets made of smoke. Something on one of the monitors caught my eye. Down the street, people appeared. They'd seen the cloud and were walking towards it. The group looked drunk and fascinated by the floating entity, so much so they were approaching it. As they did, the cloud became brighter. The street lamps around it pulsed. The group were in some kind of trance, staring into the morphine blob. One of the group, a guy, stared into it like a zombie, then walked right into the cloud and disappeared. None of the group tried to stop him. Instead, another one followed him in, and then another, and then another. All 5 members of the group disappeared into the cloud. Then they reappeared, one at a time. The guy first, then in the order they went in. Only, they weren't stumbling and boisterous and drunk now. They were walking upright, using minimal movements. They formed in a perfect 5-person circle for several seconds, over quick words, then turned and all went into separate directions. Their strides, arm swings, and speed all matched. Another monitor showed a similar situation with a larger group of people, lost in reverie as they marched, one after another, into the cloud. Each monitor showed the same thing now. People entering the clouds and coming back out, different. Mike stopped the video. I asked him if he'd shown this to anyone else. He said he hadn't. Not even to his one boss, which was a problem, because he had a meeting with his boss in the morning to discuss the missing footage. I asked why he didn't show the footage to his boss. This footage seemed more serious. People were being replaced by something. Mike sighed and put a new video on. The main monitor lit up and showed a new downtown street. The date was from earlier this week. One of the clouds was floating in the intersection. A middle-aged couple were walking nearby, the husband with a slight limp in his right leg. The couple saw the cloud and were sucked in by its aura. They approached it, eyes wide and mouths open. Both the husband and the wife entered the cloud and disappeared. After a moment, they reappeared. The husband's limp was gone. Mike turned to me and said, "That was my boss and his wife."